So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We've gathered here to engage in an open dialogue that we hope will lead to a constructive debate. The purpose of our gathering is not to provide the definitive answers, but to encourage an exchange of ideas. We are honored to have representatives from three sectors, namely the Mexican state, indigenous communities, and one international organization in the area. While representing the government of Mexico, we have Daniel, we have Isabel and Ximena representing the indigenous communities across Mexico. And last but not least, we have a representative from one international organization that works tirelessly to promote human rights, cultural diversity, and dialogue across borders. And that is me here on the behalf of UNESCO, so Valdemar. The discussion explores the emergence of the Zapatista National Liberation Army in 1994, driven by the struggles of indigenous communities against discrimination in Mexico. It addresses some of the challenges of acknowledging ethnic diversity while ensuring equality in the Mexican Constitution. The main question is how to create a modern state that embraces cultural diversity and fosters real equality and equity. So, moving on to the arguments, we'll start now. Daniel, could you please start by presenting your arguments on the topic, please?
Thank you very much, Valdemar. So the Mexican government position is that throughout the conflict, we've gathered sufficient evidence to demonstrate that there are different rebel groups and terrorist organizations giving aid and support to the Zapatistas, including ties to the Unidad Revolucionaria Nacional Guatemalteca, to the Nicaragua Sandinistas, and to the FMLN of El Salvador. These ties to foreign terrorist organizations mean that the Zapatista movement has become an attack on the sovereignty of the nation, and thus the Mexican government must act accordingly and act with the force to suppress this uprising. The Zapatistas have declared war on the Mexican government, and thus the Mexican government has followed the laws of war and human rights, respecting individuals throughout all this process. Nevertheless, the Mexican government has agreed to a ceasefire and has been in full cooperation to find an agreement that can fulfill the indigenous wishes.
Okay, well,
you muted yourself.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the indigenous communities of Mexico, I would like to start by stating that indigenous communities have a legitimate right to self-determination and autonomy. Their struggles against discrimination and marginalization, as exemplified by the Zapatista movement, highlight the urgent need to respect and uphold these rights. For instance, according to the National Council for the Evaluation of Social Development Policy, indigenous populations in Mexico often experience significantly lower educational attainment. In the same way, in 2020, it was reported that 29.2% of the indigenous population in Mexico lived in severe poverty, while only 6.4% of non-indigenous populations were considered in the same situation. These disparities, as many others, persist despite constitutional recognition of the rights. The Mexican government should not only recognize the cultural diversity of its population, but also empower indigenous communities to govern themselves and make decisions about their lands, resources, and cultural practices. Genuine equality and equity can only be achieved by granting indigenous communities that autonomy and agency they deserve. By doing so, the government can not only honor its constitutional commitments, but also foster a more inclusive and just society where all citizens can thrive regardless of their cultural backgrounds.
Now, Ximena, you also have a complemented argument for what Isabel just said.
Yes, thank you. So I think it is very, very important to be very clear about the fact that access to justice in Mexico is limited for certain sectors, not only because of the corruption and impunity that may exist, but also because of the lack of access to justice in general. What do I mean by this? Well, that the government of an entire nation seeks to safeguard and preserve the traditions and costumes of indigenous groups in its supreme law, which is our constitution, specifically in its second article, where we could give the example of Section A, fourth fraction, where it speaks of preserving and enriching their languages, knowledge, and all the elements that constitute their culture and identity. But how to achieve this if the Mexican justice system itself does not provide public prosecutors who speak indigenous languages, public defenders with a basic knowledge of indigenous dialects, and also when there is a translation of the Constitution into approximately 20 indigenous languages, when in Mexico there are about 68 indigenous languages. So according to INEGI, that's the fact, the 68 indigenous languages, which stands for the National Institute of Statistics and Geography. Then, taking this into account, 48 indigenous languages are not being considered, which have the right to know the constitutional text, which protects the human rights and individual guarantees, as well as their dignity. Finally, I would suffice to say that indeed Mexico has made several programs to help these people, but it is not enough that their recognition is embodied in text only, but that their rights are socially recognized and validated as part of Mexican society, not as something external to it. Because no doubt discrimination, as mentioned by Isabel, is a product of a systemic awareness and culture where we have not been instilled with the value to preserve and respect these groups properly.
Being an impulsor for diversity and the unity of people, we, the Mexican government, through the collaboration with indigenous communities, have created new laws and changes in the Constitution. As a consequence, the indigenous people in Mexico now have constitutional rights of self-determination, where indigenous practices and traditions will be respected and protected and taken into account at the time of the policymaking. After 2001, indigenous people will be able to determine freely their political status and consequently pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Additionally, indigenous communities will have representation in the local legislatures, guaranteeing the right to participate in the policymaking.
Thank you for presenting your points. Now I'll just move on to say what we believe from UNESCO's standpoint. So we believe that a modern state achieves harmony by deeply integrating cultural diversity into its policies. So in order to ensure equity and equality. And this kind of preservation not only preserves humanity's shared heritage, but also promotes an overall holistic development in the affected societies. So an example is the San Andrés Larrainzar Agreement, which presents a prime opportunity for Mexico, signaling the importance of earnest dialogue and meaningful implementation to serve as a bridge to the ongoing divide between the Mexican state and indigenous communities. However, for genuine reconciliation and progress to take place, a delicate balance must be upheld between the indigenous community's demands for autonomy, which stems from their unique customs and practices, and also the broader individual rights that were just discussed as provided by the Mexican government, and the general viewpoints of society, which have to ensure mutual respect and understanding. Therefore, while we cannot act as a political mediator due to the nature of our organization, we believe that both sides should consider utilizing some of our expertise, best practices from other regions, and support in terms of policies and frameworks, which aim to promote cultural preservation and understanding. Furthermore, examples from similar movements in El Salvador and South Africa suggest that opportunities for success depend on whether negotiations with insurgents, in this specific case, the EZLN, are included in democratizing pacts among the political elites. And closing on that statement, we will now move on to see if we can reach an agreement and see if there are any areas of opportunity we have observed in some of these agreements we've discussed, and how we can utilize intercultural dialogue to employ in this case.
Yes, well, now after hearing all these different points of view, I think we could all agree on the urgent need to address disparities faced by indigenous populations. Access to justice for indigenous communities is identified as a critical concern, necessitating language services and translations as well.
Yes, in order to achieve these challenges, dialogue, cooperation, and a commitment to autonomy, equity, and cultural preservation to create a more inclusive and just society in Mexico are necessary.
At the same time, it will be wise to navigate towards a proper implementation of these policies, such as the San Andrés-Laranzar Agreement, to ensure enhanced socioeconomic conditions for indigenous communities in Mexico, not just on paper, but also unfolding in real-life scenarios.
So, for instance, intercultural dialogue plays a crucial role in this context by facilitating a deeper understanding of indigenous perspectives and needs, allowing for the effective implementation of these agreements. This can both strengthen and build mutual understanding and cooperation between all stakeholders involved. So now that we have reached this agreement, I want to say thank you all for coming, and I believe that would be all for today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.